Thank you so much for talking to us. This is a slightly peculiar, unusual way of doing an interview. We are living in very unusual times at the moment.
The announcement that shook the palace. The chandeliers of Buckingham Palace cast their ancient light across corridors that have witnessed 3 centuries of royal secrets, but none quite like this. 5 minutes ago, in a synchronized statement that sent shockwaves through every corner of the Commonwealth, King Charles III and Prince William confirmed what palace insiders have whispered about for months. Princess Charlotte of Wales, the young royal who turned 9 years old in May of this year, will assume a role unprecedented in the 1,000-year history of the British monarchy. The announcement came not with fanfare, but with the quiet dignity that characterizes the House of Windsor at its most serious. The king stood in the blue drawing room, his face bearing the weight of a decision that will reshape the very architecture of royal succession. Beside him, transmitted via secure video link from Adelaide Cottage in Windsor, William appeared both proud and protective, his hand occasionally moving as though to shield something precious just beyond the camera's view. Between them, they delivered news that has already begun to rewrite the narrative of Britain's future. The decision did not come easily. Palace sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, describe meetings that stretched deep into the night, debates that became heated, and compromises that satisfied no one completely. The king faced opposition from traditionalists who see any deviation from established protocol as dangerous precedent. William confronted his own demons, remembering too well how the spotlight destroyed his mother and fearing history's cruel repetition. Yet both men arrived at the same conclusion through different paths. The monarchy must evolve or face irrelevance, and Charlotte, with her unique combination of youth, intelligence, and natural diplomacy, represents their best hope for that evolution. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, maintained a studied silence during the announcement, but those who know her recognize the signs. Her advocacy for early childhood development, her careful curation of her children's public appearances, her fierce protection of their privacy, all of it has led to this moment. She has prepared Charlotte not by pushing her forward, but by teaching her when to step back. In the brief footage released alongside the announcement, Charlotte appeared for exactly 7 seconds, standing between her parents in the garden at Adelaide Cottage, wearing a simple blue dress that matched her eyes. She did not smile for the camera. She did not wave. She simply stood, poised and present, and in that stillness communicated more than any carefully crafted statement ever could. The timing proves equally significant. The announcement comes as the king marks his 2nd year on the throne, a period defined by his determination to slim down the monarchy, to make it more efficient, more accountable, more aligned with contemporary British values. It comes as William and Catherine navigate their own transition into senior working royals while attempting to give their children something approximating a normal childhood. And it comes as Charlotte herself stands at the threshold between childhood innocence and royal responsibility. Old enough to understand what is being asked of her, but young enough to grow into the role rather than be crushed by it. In the 5 minutes since the announcement, social media has erupted with reactions ranging from jubilation to outrage, from feminist celebration to traditionalist condemnation. The hashtag Princess Charlotte began trending worldwide within 90 seconds. Republican movements in Australia and Jamaica issued cautious statements. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who will play a crucial role in any constitutional changes, released a message of prayerful support. And in living rooms across Britain and throughout the Commonwealth, families began discussing what this means, not just for Charlotte, but for every daughter watching, every girl who has been told to wait her turn, to step aside, to accept second place as her birthright. The palace has promised a full briefing in 48 hours. Until then, the world waits, watches, and wonders what prompted 2 of the most cautious men in public life to make such a bold, irreversible decision. the princess they never expected. Long before today's announcement, those closest to the Wales family recognized something exceptional about their only daughter. Charlotte Elizabeth Diana, named for her great-grandmother, her grandmother, and the grandmother she would never meet, arrived into the world on May 2, 2015, welcomed by crowds but also by a question that had haunted royal births for centuries. Would she matter as much as her brothers? The question itself revealed the problem. Prince George, born 2 years earlier, had been celebrated as the future king from his first breath. Prince Louis, born 3 years later, would be cherished as the spare. But Charlotte occupied that peculiar middle space, important enough to warrant protection and protocol, but not important enough to shape her own destiny within the institution. Or so everyone assumed. Catherine understood the trap before anyone else. She had lived it herself, scrutinized and judged, reduced to her wardrobe choices and her ability to produce heirs. She had watched Diana's daughters-in-law navigate similar constraints, and had observed how the institution could simultaneously elevate and diminish the women within it. She made a private vow, confided only to William during a late-night conversation in their Kensington Palace apartment, that Charlotte would be different. Charlotte would be prepared. Charlotte would have choices. The preparation began subtly. While George attended carefully curated public events designed to familiarize him with his future role, Charlotte's appearances followed a different pattern. She accompanied her mother to charity events focused on childhood development and mental health. She sat in on meetings, too young to contribute but old enough to observe. She learned, without being explicitly taught, how power could be wielded gently, how influence could flow through conversation rather than command, how a carefully chosen word could accomplish what volumes of decree could not. William watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and pain. He saw flashes of his mother in her directness, her refusal to pretend emotions she did not feel, her instinctive reading of social dynamics. But he also saw something distinctly her own, a gravity that neither George nor Louis possessed, an awareness that set her apart even in family photographs. When Charlotte looked at the camera, she seemed to look through it, past the lens to the millions beyond, recognizing even at her young age that privacy was a luxury her birthright had stolen. The king noticed too. During private family gatherings at Balmoral, he observed how Charlotte moved through rooms, how she listened more than she spoke, how she positioned herself not at the center of attention but slightly to the side, watching, learning, cataloging information that might prove useful later. He recognized the pattern because he had lived it himself during his own long apprenticeship as heir apparent. Charlotte possessed what his own youth had lacked, the ability to understand that power delayed is not power denied, but rather power refined. The room fell silent. Security shifted position. Palace advisors mentally drafted crisis communications. But before William could respond, Charlotte stood. She walked to the microphone, looked at the young woman, and said something that was not recorded because it was not meant to be. Whatever words passed between them lasted less than a minute, but when Charlotte returned to her seat, the young woman was crying, and the atmosphere in the room had transformed from confrontational to contemplative. William never asked his daughter what she said. Catherine did later that night, and Charlotte's response was characteristic in its simplicity. She had told the truth. She had acknowledged the pain, admitted the history, and offered not empty promises but a sincere question. What would make it better? The young woman had answered and Charlotte had listened, and in that exchange, something fundamental had shifted. The king learned of the incident through his private secretary who had been present at the summit. He requested the footage, watched it 17 times, and made a decision. The monarchy needed Charlotte not despite her youth, but because of it. She could say things, do things, reach people in ways that he and William never could. The institution had spent decades trying to modernize by changing its messaging. Perhaps what it needed was to change its messengers. The king agreed to everything. He understood what his son could not yet fully grasp, that in protecting Charlotte, William was also freeing her. The restrictions would become her armor, the boundaries of her strength. She would enter public life not as a victim of circumstance, but as an architect of her own destiny, within the considerable constraints that royalty imposed, but with more agency than any princess before her had ever possessed. And so the decision was made, the announcement prepared. And today, 5 minutes ago, the world learned what the family has known for months. Princess Charlotte is no longer simply a princess. She is a promise, a bridge, a radical experiment in whether monarchy can matter to a generation that questions everything. The real question now is not whether she is ready for the role, but whether the role and the institution behind it is ready for her. The weight of a crown, not yet worn. The morning after the announcement, Charlotte attended school as usual. This detail, carefully leaked to select journalists, was meant to communicate normalcy, continuity, the promise that despite everything that has changed, the girl herself remains unchanged. But anyone who has lived under the weight of public expectation understands the lie inherent in such reassurances. Everything has changed, and Charlotte, for all her remarkable poise, is still 9 years old. Lambrook School in Berkshire has educated royal children before, but never one quite like this. The headmaster received a private briefing from palace officials 2 days before the public announcement, giving him time to prepare staff and implement additional security protocols. The other parents were informed via a carefully worded letter that emphasized the school's commitment to treating all students equally, while acknowledging that circumstances had evolved. But in the playground, among children too young to fully grasp constitutional implications, but old enough to sense significance, Charlotte's status shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Her best friend, whose name is protected by privacy laws and palace discretion, later told her own parents that Charlotte seemed quieter than usual, more watchful. During lunch, instead of sitting with her usual group, Charlotte chose a table near the windows, positioning herself where she could observe without being surrounded. When a teacher asked if everything was all right, Charlotte smiled and said she was fine, deploying even at 9 years old the same deflection tactics her father has perfected over decades. The teacher, trained to recognize distress in children, recognized something else instead: a child already learning to hide. William struggled with this most of all. That evening, he canceled his scheduled engagements and returned to Adelaide Cottage earlier than planned. He found Charlotte in the small study that Catherine had converted into a homework space. Books spread before her, but her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the page. He sat beside her in silence for several minutes, a technique his own father had never mastered, but which William learned through therapy and trial and error with his own children. Finally, Charlotte spoke. She asked if she could change her mind. Not defiantly, not emotionally, but with the same straightforward directness that had characterized her question to the Jamaican activist. William's heart, by his own later admission to a close friend, broke a little in that moment, because the honest answer was no, she could not change her mind, not really. The announcement had been made, the constitutional wheels set in motion, the world's attention focused upon her in ways that could not be undone simply because a 9-year-old girl was having second thoughts about a decision made largely by adults on her behalf. But William did not say no. Instead, he asked her what she was afraid of. Charlotte considered the question with the seriousness it deserved before answering. She was not afraid of the work, she said. She was not afraid of speaking to people or attending events, or even of the cameras, though she did not particularly enjoy them. What frightened her was the possibility of failing, of disappointing people, of being the reason the monarchy became irrelevant rather than its salvation. The king resisted this final point most strenuously. Such a clause, he argued, undermined the entire purpose, suggested impermanence, created the possibility of failure before success could even be attempted. But William held firm with a stubbornness inherited from both his grandmother and his late mother. His daughter would have agency, or she would have nothing. The king, faced with his son's intransigence and perhaps remembering his own struggles against institutional inflexibility, relented. Her most effective intervention came during a small dinner at Clarence's house, where she sat beside the king and shared photographs from Charlotte's birthday party several months earlier. Simple images: Charlotte laughing with friends, her face smeared with cake, her eyes bright with uncomplicated joy. Catherine did not make speeches or issue ultimatums. She simply showed her father-in-law what they risked losing in their rush to save an institution. The king, who has experienced his own complicated relationship with duty versus desire, understood. Meanwhile, Charlotte herself navigated her new reality with a resilience that both reassured and worried those closest to her. She attended a scheduled visit to a children's hospital, her first public engagement since the announcement, and moved through the ward with practiced ease. She spoke to sick children with genuine warmth, asked questions that revealed actual interest rather than rehearsed curiosity, and even comforted a crying toddler with an unself-consciousness that melted the hearts of watching nurses. The footage, carefully distributed to media outlets, showed exactly what the palace wanted the world to see: a natural, compassionate young girl growing gracefully into her role. What the cameras did not capture was Charlotte in the car afterward, staring out the window in silence for the entire 40-minute drive back to Windsor. What they did not record was her question to Catherine that evening, asked with the bluntness of childhood: "Why do people care more about what I do than about the children who are actually sick?" Catherine had no good answer, because there is no good answer. Only the complicated truth that symbolic gestures matter to humans in ways that transcend logic or fairness. But perhaps the most significant preparation happened away from offices and official briefings. George, in a conversation overheard by palace staff, told his younger sister that being third in line was actually better than being first, because she could do interesting things while he had to be boring and careful. Louis, with the uncomplicated affection of a 6-year-old, simply hugged Charlotte more frequently, his child's instinct recognizing something the adults around him could articulate but not quite solve. His sister needed reassurance more than she needed responsibility. The king watched all of this unfold with feelings he struggled to name. Pride, certainly, in a granddaughter who displayed more natural diplomacy than most trained ambassadors. Concern for the burden being placed on young shoulders, but also something more complex, a recognition that in Charlotte, the monarchy had found something it had lacked for generations, not just a symbol or a figurehead, but a genuine bridge between the ancient institution and a future that might still have room for it. Whether that bridge could bear the weight being placed upon it remained, 5 minutes and several days after the announcement that changed everything, very much an open question. The Commonwealth's quiet revolution. The Commonwealth, that peculiar association of 56 nations bound by history, language, and the increasingly tenuous thread of shared monarchy, watched the Charlotte announcement with particular intensity. For decades, these nations have grappled with their relationship to the crown, balancing tradition against the uncomfortable realities of colonial legacy, weighing the benefits of association against the costs of continued connection to an institution many view as fundamentally outdated. Charlotte's appointment as Ambassador for Youth and Commonwealth Futures represented either a desperate attempt to maintain relevance or a genuine evolution toward something new. The verdict varied depending on which capital city one asked. The response from Jamaica proved even more pointed. The island nation has made clear its intention to follow Barbados into republican status, a decision driven partly by practical governance considerations, but also by a deeper reckoning with the meaning of independence and self-determination. When news of Charlotte's appointment broke, youth leaders in Kingston organized an impromptu forum to discuss what meaningful Commonwealth engagement might actually look like. Their consensus: it would require listening more than speaking, learning more than teaching, and acknowledging uncomfortable truths that royal protocol typically avoids. Yet not all Commonwealth reactions tilted negative. In smaller island nations of the Pacific and Caribbean, where the personal connection between monarch and people has historically run deeper, Charlotte's youth was seen as potentially advantageous. A representative from Tuvalu, speaking at a Commonwealth Youth Conference in Singapore, suggested that Charlotte's generation had no personal connection to empire, no direct responsibility for historical wrongs, and might therefore approach Commonwealth relationships with fresh perspective, unburdened by defensive nostalgia. Her youth could be a liability or an asset, depending entirely on how the role was actually executed. The palace understood these dynamics better than critics might assume. The decision to position Charlotte as an ambassador rather than a traditional royal patron reflected hard-won lessons from failed tours and fumbled engagements. When William and Catherine visited the Caribbean in March of 2022, they faced protests, pointed questions, and widespread criticism for what was perceived as tone-deaf pageantry, disconnected from contemporary concerns. The trip, meant to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, instead accelerated Republican sentiment and forced uncomfortable reckonings within the palace about how monarchy could function in former colonies. Charlotte's role was designed, at least in theory, to avoid these pitfalls. Rather than touring with elaborate motorcades and ceremonial distance, her engagements would focus on small group discussions, youth forums, and genuine dialogue. Rather than arriving with predetermined agendas, she would be positioned as a listener, a learner, someone authentically curious about the lives and concerns of young Commonwealth citizens. The model was less traditional royal tour and more extended educational exchange, with Charlotte both teaching and being taught. But theory and practice diverge most dramatically when confronted with the realities of protocol, security, and media management. Charlotte's first planned international engagement, scheduled for the following spring in Canada, involved months of preparation, multiple security assessments, and detailed negotiations about every aspect of her visit. The Canadian government, while officially welcoming, also needed to manage its own complex relationship with the monarchy, balancing the preferences of monarchist citizens against the concerns of Indigenous communities for whom the Crown represented historical trauma rather than benign tradition. The compromise reached was instructive. Charlotte would visit, but not in traditional royal fashion. She would attend a youth climate summit in Vancouver, participate in workshops rather than simply observe them, and spend time with Indigenous youth leaders in a setting that prioritized conversation over ceremony. Most significantly, the visit would be framed not as Charlotte bringing enlightenment from the imperial center, but as Charlotte learning from diverse perspectives, her role explicitly educational rather than instructional. Even this carefully calibrated approach faced criticism. Indigenous activists pointed out that no amount of careful framing could change the fundamental power imbalance, that Charlotte's presence would inevitably center British royalty in conversations that should focus on Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. Youth climate organizers worried that media attention would shift from substantive policy discussions to coverage of what Charlotte wore and how she smiled. And Republican movements across Canada saw the visit as precisely the kind of calculated charm offensive that made monarchy insidious, using an appealing child to soften opposition and maintain an institution that should be consigned to history. The king, monitoring these debates from London, faced his own reckoning with the limitations of even well-intentioned reform. He had genuinely believed that Charlotte's appointment represented progressive change, a monarchy adapting to modern values and contemporary expectations. But the responses from Commonwealth nations forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. For many people, especially in formerly colonized countries, The problem was not how the monarchy presented itself, but what it fundamentally represented. No amount of modernization could change the historical reality that the crown sat atop a pyramid built through conquest, extraction, and exploitation. William approached the same realization from a different angle. During a private conversation with a senior diplomat from Ghana, he asked directly what Commonwealth nations actually wanted from the monarchy. The diplomat's response, delivered with the candor of a long acquaintance, was devastating in its simplicity. Many wanted nothing. They maintained Commonwealth membership for practical benefits like trade agreements and educational exchanges, but the monarchical element was at best irrelevant and at worst actively problematic. Charlotte's appointment would not change this fundamental indifference, though it might delay the inevitable dissolution of Commonwealth realms into fully independent republics. Yet within this sobering assessment lay possibility. If the monarchy could not maintain its position through tradition and inherited authority, perhaps it could earn relevance through genuine service and authentic engagement. Charlotte, unburdened by personal responsibility for historical wrongs and genuinely interested in global youth issues, might actually connect with her generation in ways her grandfather and father never could. The challenge was ensuring that her role remained substantive rather than symbolic, that she was given real agency to learn, grow, and even make mistakes rather than being positioned as a perfectly polished product of palace machinery. The test would come in how the institution responded when Charlotte inevitably encountered difficult questions or uncomfortable situations. Would she be allowed to speak honestly about colonial legacy, climate injustice, and structural inequality? Would she be permitted to acknowledge the complicated feelings many Commonwealth citizens had toward the crown? Or would palace handlers intervene, smoothing rough edges and managing messages until Charlotte became just another carefully controlled royal presence, indistinguishable from the system she was supposedly meant to transform? These questions remained unanswered as preparations for the Canada visit continued. Charlotte herself, in her limited exposure to these debates, approached them with characteristic directness. During a preparation session, when asked how she would respond if someone told her the monarchy should be abolished, she apparently said she would ask them why they felt that way and then listen to their answer. The simplicity of the response delighted some advisors and alarmed others, but it captured something essential about Charlotte's potential value: her willingness to engage with discomfort rather than deflect from it. The Commonwealth, vast and varied and increasingly restless, would ultimately judge Charlotte not by her lineage or her title, but by her authenticity and her actions. Whether a 9-year-old princess could navigate these complex currents while also simply being a child remained the question that kept both William and Catherine awake at night, staring at bedroom ceilings and wondering if they had made the right choice for their daughter, their family, and the institution they served, whether they always wanted to or not. The future arrives early. 6 days after the announcement that reshaped her life, Princess Charlotte attended her school's winter concert. She sang in the choir, her voice one among many, her position in the back row deliberately chosen to emphasize normalcy and deflect attention. But cameras waited outside nonetheless, and social media erupted with analysis of her expression, her posture, her every visible gesture. This was her new reality, a life lived in the space between extraordinary expectation and ordinary childhood, with no clear map for how to navigate between the two. The palace released no statement about the concert, no photographs, no carefully curated glimpses of royal family life. This silence itself constituted a statement, a boundary drawn between public duty and private existence. Catherine had insisted on this distinction with a fierceness that surprised even those who knew her well. Charlotte's official role would come with official engagements, properly staffed and thoughtfully planned. But her childhood, what remained of it, would be protected with whatever power the Princess of Wales could marshal. William attended this meeting, an unusual step that signaled his personal investment in getting this right. He listened as experts debated engagement frequency, media access, educational requirements, and security protocols. But when the conversation turned to Charlotte's first major speech, planned for a Commonwealth youth event in 6 months, he intervened with a question that cut through the careful planning. Had anyone asked Charlotte what she wanted to say? The silence that followed provided its own answer. The king, informed of this exchange, recognized his son's point, but also the practical problem it created. Charlotte was 9 years old. 9-year-olds, even exceptionally mature ones, lacked the knowledge, perspective, and experience to craft speeches on constitutional matters or Commonwealth relations. Guidance was necessary, structure essential. Yet William's question gestured toward a deeper truth. If Charlotte was to be authentic rather than performative, her voice needed to remain genuinely hers, even if that voice required support and development. A compromise emerged gradually through multiple conversations and careful negotiations. Charlotte would work with speechwriters, but only after extensive discussions where she would share her actual thoughts, concerns, and questions. The resulting speeches would blend her authentic voice with appropriate context and diplomatic care, aiming for something neither purely childish nor artificially adult. She would be allowed to sound 9 years old, to express uncertainty, to ask questions rather than simply provide answers. This approach terrified traditionalists who believed royal speeches should project authority and certainty, but it excited those who understood that Charlotte's greatest asset was precisely her youth, her fresh perspective unburdened by decades of careful conditioning. The Canadian visit approaching rapidly became the test case for this new approach. Charlotte spent weekends reviewing materials about Canada, its Indigenous peoples, its colonial history, its contemporary challenges with climate change and reconciliation. But she also watched Canadian television shows, learned about hockey, and studied photographs of Vancouver's landscapes. When asked what interested her most, she fixated on the concept of reconciliation, the idea that terrible historical wrongs could be acknowledged without being erased, that moving forward required looking backward honestly. Her questions revealed both her intelligence and her inexperience. She asked why Britain had treated Indigenous peoples badly if the Crown was supposed to care for all its subjects. She wanted to know if saying sorry actually helped or just made the person apologizing feel better. She wondered whether Indigenous youth in Canada resented her or just felt indifferent. These were not the carefully calibrated queries of a trained diplomat, but the direct, sometimes uncomfortable questions of a child trying to understand complex realities. The palace team faced a choice: smooth these rough edges or preserve them as evidence of authenticity. Catherine advocated strongly for the latter approach. In a private memo that later leaked to select journalists, she argued that Charlotte's naivety was not a liability to be managed, but an asset to be carefully preserved. A 9-year-old asking honest questions about colonialism and reconciliation could open conversations that adult royals could never access. The key was protecting Charlotte from the backlash such honesty might generate while allowing her to maintain the directness that made her valuable. The king read this memo 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of both wisdom and risk. His daughter-in-law understood something important about modern communication, about how authenticity cut through Polish in ways that traditional royal performance could not match. But she perhaps underestimated the cruelty of public discourse, the way vulnerability gets weaponized, the reality that Charlotte's honest questions might be twisted into evidence of ignorance or insensitivity. He wanted to protect his granddaughter. He also needed her to succeed. Whether these goals were compatible remained unclear. George watched his sister's transformation with the complicated feelings of an older sibling who loves deeply but also resents displacement. He was the heir, the future king, yet Charlotte commanded attention and sparked conversations that his own carefully managed appearances never generated. During a rare moment when the three siblings were allowed simply to play, building elaborate structures with blocks in the Adelaide Cottage playroom, George asked Charlotte if she liked being special. Charlotte, with the honesty that characterized their private interactions, said no, not really, but she did not know how to stop it. George's response, later recounted by a nanny to palace officials, revealed wisdom beyond his 11 years. Maybe she did not need to stop it. Maybe she just needed to decide what special meant. Louis, too young to fully grasp the implications but old enough to sense disruption, dealt with the changes by becoming the family comedian, diffusing tension with silly voices and exaggerated falls. Catherine welcomed this, recognizing that humor provided necessary relief from the weight of expectation. But she also worried that Louis was learning even at 6 to manage adult emotions through performance, to smooth difficult moments by making himself entertaining. The patterns were establishing themselves early, the roles solidifying. George, the steady heir; Charlotte, the bridge to the future; Louis, the delightful distraction. Each role came with costs not yet fully calculated. As the days passed and the Canadian visit drew nearer, Charlotte herself seemed to settle into her new reality with resilience that both impressed and concerned those watching closely. She completed her homework, attended her classes, played with her friends, and slowly, incrementally, prepared for a role that should not exist for someone so young. In quiet moments, she would ask Catherine questions: whether people would hate her, whether she could quit if it became too hard, whether being royal meant never being truly happy. Catherine answered honestly when she could, and held her daughter when honesty provided no comfort. The announcement was 5 minutes ago, 5 days ago, 5 transformations ago. Princess Charlotte of Wales was still 9 years old, still a child who loved art and gymnastics, still a girl who occasionally cried when frustrated and laughed when tickled. But she was also, now and forever, something else, a symbol of change, a test of whether monarchy could evolve, a young soul carrying hopes and fears and expectations that no single person, regardless of birth or title, should have to bear alone. Whether the institution would support her or consume her, whether her parents could protect her while allowing her to grow, whether she would look back on this moment with pride or resentment, none of these questions had answers yet. They had only time stretching forward into a future that arrived, for Charlotte, far earlier than it should have. This is the story of a princess who carries not just a title, but the weight of change itself. The world watches, waiting to see if Charlotte will transform the monarchy, or if the monarchy will transform her. Subscribe to follow her unprecedented journey as it unfolds, because this story is only beginning.